I tell people, you don't hate religion, you hate what religion's become in America, which is another way to separate us versus them, right versus left, Christian versus non-Christian. It's become a tribal identity, not sort of a lived experience.
And on the Michael Medved Show, it is a great honor and privilege and joy to welcome back to the show Ryan Burge, who has been with us many times before. He is a professor of practice at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. He is also the author or co-author of 4 books. The most recent one is released today. It is called The Vanishing Church, How the Hollowing Out of Moderate Congregations is Hurting Democracy, Faith, and Us. Ryan, congratulations on the book. And when you talk about the Vanishing Church, you were a pastor of a Baptist church for many years. How long?
17 and a half years.
And do you still do pastoral work?
I preach here and there, but I've told many people, I've been approached with opportunities to become a pastor of a church, and you know what, I put my time in. I was pastoring from my time I was 20 years old till I was 42. I was on staff of a church somewhere, and that was a time of my life I appreciate, and I'm very glad I did. But I'm also a time of my life where I'm glad I don't have to get up on Sunday morning and preach a sermon. I can just sit in the back pew and do my thing and just listen. It's just nice to be on the other side of things.
Okay, so what is going to be most helpful or important in getting other people to come into those back pews or come into churches or synagogues anywhere? What is keeping people away or sending them away from organized religious services?
I think one big thing is we're just less social now than we've ever been before. And, this has been an ongoing thing for literally decades. Robert Putnam traced this in Bowling Alone. People aren't bowling in bowling leagues. They're not going to the Elks and the Moose, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts. But, church was sort of the last bastion of socialization we had in America, but that's sort of fallen. Putnam wrote his book in 1999. So that's declined too. And I think the reality, what's funny is about Putnam is he blamed it on cable television because that was the major technological innovation of the 1990s. It's like, now we have 100 channels. Well, now we've got 1 billion channels. So now it's easier than ever to entertain ourselves by being at home. And it's just, a lot of people would pick the couch. That's their alternative to even doing anything social, not just church. So I think it's this larger move away from just going out of the house and being social and being around other people. And I think the other part of it is people just they think they have to believe everything to show up. They'll feel like a heretic or a hypocrite. And it's like, listen, most people sitting in those pews, they're heretics and hypocrites too, but we're all in this together. And I think, that vulnerability is what we need to hear more of from religious leaders and say, just come. We're just happy to have you here, whether you believe in all of it or none of it. We're just happy to have you in that back pew.
And that believing in all of it or none of it, that also goes to politics, doesn't it? I know that you've written before in the past. I haven't read the new book, The Vanishing Church, yet, but I plan to because it's been very informative in the past. You talk about how the association of churches with political ideology has made it more difficult for people to actually access the deeper meanings of faith. Explain.
Yeah, I think people forget the fact that, the case of the white evangelical church, it's a Republican denomination. In the 1970s, the majority of white evangelicals were Democrats. And even through the 1990s, the church was mixed. Equal
They
number
were
of
Democrats who voted for Jimmy Carter, who was, I think, our first openly self-described evangelical Christian president.
That's right. And now the modern iteration of evangelicalism is not only are we Republicans, if you're a Christian, you can't vote for Democrats. That's an evil party. And I think, and actually the biggest driver of secularization in America right now is politics. If you look at, political ideology, about half of very liberal people are non-religious, and it's only 12% of very conservative people. So that's actually driving a lot of people away from the church because the church, especially the white church in America, has become incredibly one note. And even the Catholic Church, the white Catholic vote now is 65% for Donald Trump. in 2024 when it was about 55% for McCain in 2008. So even in they're moving to the right as well. So I think the reality is for a lot of young people, if you're a white liberal person, you would look around and go, why would I go to a church? Because that's conservative stuff, and I'm a liberal. I have to be an atheist because that's what we are. I think that's actually one of the reasons religions decline so quickly in America is because politics have gotten, so we've gotten so politically homogenous in American religion.
Okay, there are a couple of issues that are on the table that used to be defined as dividing people based upon religious outlook. One of them, of course, was the abortion issue. Now that we've had the Dobbs decision and there is no longer Roe v. Wade as the law of the land, why has that not worked in somehow depoliticizing the churches in America?
What's funny about Dobbs is it actually moved American public opinion on abortion toward the liberal side. It actually made people more willing to support abortion access. And if you look at polling data on abortion going back 50 years, it's actually not changed a whole lot until Dobbs, and then it moved to the left pretty noticeably. I think the reality is a lot of these institutions have these very strident positions on abortion, like the Catholic Church obviously is anti-abortion. Most evangelical Southern Baptist conventions anti-abortion. But if you actually look at the pews, what people actually believe and tell us on polls, very few, even 25% of evangelicals say that abortion should be illegal in America. That's evangelical, not all Americans. The group that should think it's illegal, and a majority of Catholics are in favor of abortion on demand. So, I tell people, like, if you think that abortion's murder, and that's really your position, I can understand where you come from theologically, but if that's such a self-evident position, then why have you been so ineffective at convincing Americans that your position is right over the last 50 years? Because we've seen public opinion move the other direction. So why can't you convince more Americans to be pro-life on these issues? And I think in some ways that's become a litmus test. As a Republican politician, you have to hold out this issue that basically a lot of your constituents don't even agree with. So I think it's a classic example of like institutions are polarized, but the average American is really in the Bill Clinton camp, safe, legal, and rare. That's where the average American is right now.
Well, the other big issue where there has been real progress or not progress, movement, because you don't want to define it as progress or retrogression, but the issue of same-sex marriage. The overwhelming majority of folks approve of same-sex marriage right now, don't they?
Yeah, but interestingly enough, there's been a slight backlash in support for same-sex marriage the last couple of years, especially among Republicans. It's still majority support, and I just don't see a future where the majority of Americans won't support same-sex marriage. But there's definitely been sort of like a conservative backlash against things like same-sex marriage, legalizing marijuana, sports gambling. I think there's been a sort of cultural conservatism that's crept in to America the last maybe 5 years or so as we've seen what's happened with all these institutions changing so fast.
Okay, if that cultural conservatism is a genuine wave, what can Republicans or conservatives do most effectively to take advantage of it, to ride the wave, to surf successfully to some electoral victories, beyond the questions of Trumpism or the personality of one individual leader? We'll get to that and more with Ryan Burge, who is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis, the author of the new book, The Vanishing Church, released today. We will be right back. And one of the phenomena that is described by Ryan Burge, our guest, who's a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. He is also the author and spent 17 years as a pastor of a Baptist church. Is that right, Ryan?
Yeah, American Baptist Church. That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, now, which is different, American Baptist, from Southern Baptist Convention. And this is one of the things that you talk about and write about, is that the more moderate denominations seem to have been particularly hard hit. If the truth is that all of this polarization, people extreme on one side, extreme on another side, has hurt the country, why is it so difficult to do something where religion actually brings people together rather than polarizing them?
Yeah, it's actually, I tell people, you don't hate religion, you hate what religion's become in America, which is another way to separate us versus them, right versus left, Christian versus non-Christian. it's become a tribal identity, not sort of a lived experience. And you're actually seeing that more and more with the Republican side of the ledger. You're seeing Republicans are less and less likely to go to church every year, but the share who say religion's very important has actually stayed really steady. So it's like they like the idea of religion and they think religion has a powerful, positive impact on American society, but they actually don't want to get off their couch on Sunday morning and show up, which is kind of tragic because if you actually look at the different, like the ways we express religiosity, the most positive one for you personally is showing up at a house of worship on a regular basis. And unfortunately, that's the kind of religion that's dropping the fastest in America. 40% of Americans say they go to church less than once a year now. That's the part that actually would probably instill the most benefits, not just for them personally, but also for their community and for democracy. And they're just not showing up.
Okay, so the main need to take some of these more moderate and open denominations that aren't so ideologically driven uh, is what? In other words, is there an example of a particular denomination or religious approach that has worked better than others to survive this trend to become one of the nuns, people who say they have no religious affiliation?
That's the hard part. People are like, well, how do we get out of this morass that we're in? And the reality is the main line, which are, Methodist, Episcopalians, Lutherans, American Baptists, Disciples of Christ, United Church of Christ. Those churches are all down 40, 50, 60% in membership from the late 1980s, and they're sort of sliding towards irrelevance. I have heard some stories. I hang out with some Episcopalians from time to time that they're actually adopting the evangelical church planting model, where they're finding a young priest who's coming out of seminary all gung-ho and energetic and charismatic, and they're basically throwing money at that person, saying, start a new church. We'll give you however much money you need to start a church. And if you need more money, come back. Because the Episcopalians, by and large, are well-resourced. They just don't have enough people. So, they're actually taking a page out of the evangelical book. Instead of trying to revitalize these churches that have been declining for 50, 60, 70 years, let's start something fresh, with young people, and maybe we can bring back the denomination that way. To me, that's really the only path that many of these churches have going forward is don't focus on trying to, keep these older churches around. They're going to die anyway. Try something new somewhere else and see what happens there.
Okay, meanwhile, you published a piece which was called a 2024 presidential election postmortem. And one of the things you talk about in that piece is this very intense God gap.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that if you're a Democrat and you're somebody who voted for Kamala Harris, the chances are overwhelming that you have minimal religious commitment. And if you voted for Trump, on the other hand, Trump, his victory in 2024 really depended on winning, over 80% of self-described evangelical voters, right?
Mm-hmm. You can't, it's hard for people to fully conceptualize how polarized we are when it comes to religion. For instance, the evangelical, 40% of all Trump voters were evangelicals, white, non-white evangelicals. But then 45% of Harris voters were atheists, agnostics, or people who claim no religion in particular. So, 25% of Trump voters are atheist agnostics. Harris voters are atheist agnostics. It was less than 3% of Trump voters. So the parties have really sorted themselves out when it comes to politics. The Republican Party is the party of Christianity, white Christianity particularly. Almost 75% of all Trump voters were white Christians. And the Democratic Party is this really weird mishmash of the non-religious, like we said, but also black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, but also Hindus, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews. So they're sort of the party of everybody else when it comes to religion. The problem for Republicans is white Christianity is declining in America. The problem for the Democrats is how do you make atheists and black Protestants happy at the same time, because they're not at all the same voter.
Okay, so what would your advice, after having done this analysis about the election of 2024,
Mm-hmm.
it was not an overwhelming election, one direction or another. What do the Democrats need to do to be more competitive, at least with religious voters?
I think the first thing I would say is there's still a lot of Christians in America, especially a lot of white. 47% of Americans are white Christians still, and the Democratic Party seems like they want to talk about everybody else except for white Christianity. I did an analysis of the Twitter accounts of the candidates running for president on the Democratic side in 2020. They talked more about Islam than they talked about Christianity. And Islam is 1% of America, and Christians are 63% of America. So, what are you doing here, right? You still got to try to win back some of those white Christians who would have voted for Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, who really don't want to vote for the party now because they're not talking about those people. They say you're talking more about trans people and you're talking about Christian people. And the reality is that's probably true. So I think the Democrats have just got to realize they can win back some of these Christian votes, especially given what Trump's done the last couple of years that seem pretty immoral and against the teachings of Jesus. Like there's some room there. I think the Republicans need to think about winning over some non-religious voters. There's a lot of them out there and they're growing, especially among young people. There are ways to win over sort of libertarian nuns, maybe socially moderate nuns. But when you keep talking about Christianity and the Bible over and over again, that's also sort of repulsive to a lot of those non-religious people. So I think it's a messaging thing for both parties. They need to realize their tent needs to get bigger, and it could pretty easily get bigger if they just message better.
Okay, and when you were talking about messaging better, what would be the core underlying message that Americans on both sides need to hear?
Yeah, I think for the Democrats, you got to say, there's things that are morally right and morally wrong in America. And while we can say that, removing people who are here illegally is a morally right thing, there's the actions taken by some ICE agents are morally wrong. So, doing something evil in service of something good is probably still evil. We can still have our compassion and our character, but also enforce the law, which is what the Trump administration does not seem at all interested in. The Republican message is actually very simple. The Democratic Party can't stand up for anything, it feels like. It feels like they're immoral and you can't, when you ask them at what point should we, put restrictions on abortion, they won't give you an answer. I mean, come on now. Like, we got to be real about this. Like, can't you just pick a date? 20 weeks, 24 weeks, 30 weeks, just pick a date. The Democratic Party does not want to be pinned down on these issues because they're being taken over by the far left activist fringe of their own party. So I think there's easy ways that each party could just sort of tweak their messaging a little bit. On abortion, the Democrats can say, yeah, we're in favor of abortion, but we favor broad exceptions for people who have a problem with conscience, participating in abortion procedures. Guess what? A lot of Christians, that's where they are on those issues. There's ways to speak to these people without turning off your base.
Okay, the last question. A lot of people are expecting that there will be a contest between J.D. Vance on the Republican side and Gavin Newsom on the Democratic side in the next election. Who would have the best advantage of expanding his base beyond religious stereotypes?
I think from a macro level perspective, I think whoever's running on the Democratic side is going to have an advantage because of just the Trump fatigue we've had over the last, 12 years of Trump in office. I think Vance is a good candidate, well-spoken, strong on the stump, good religious background, but I think structurally it's hard to overcome, just the Trump fatigue and the Republican fatigue the average American's feeling right now.
Well, he also has that issue about having himself being a Catholic. He says devout Catholic, and a wife who is not Christian. She's Hindu.
That's correct. Yep.
But all of that is complicated. Those complications made more comprehensible by Ryan Burge. Check out his book, The Vanishing Church, just released today. It's posted up at our website at MichaelMedved.com. Happy New Year, Ryan, and best things to all of us.
Thanks so much for having me.